Okay, well, so what we want to try to do is cover some of the pre-class material that we've missed out on because of the nice snow, and I want to get into just very quickly discovering the three waves of cognitive therapy. And we're going to work through wave one, two, and three here in the next hour and kind of shorten this lecture a little bit, but see if we can't get it online and see if you guys can get just a little bit of an introduction to some of these early concepts and how they'll ultimately play themselves out throughout the course when we think about the kind of interventions that we use today. Um, so, the first wave of cognitive therapy really came out of the laboratory setting, if you will. It was, the early behaviorist, Pavlov, Skinner, and these two represent two different branches of cognitive therapy. Um, Pavlov being the classical conditioning branch, and Skinner being the operant conditioning branch, and they, as we'll see later, very nicely fit together in ways that make sense of fairly complex forms of psychopathology, especially all of the anxiety disorders and mood disorders and depression in particular. And as we go through the course, you'll see how they come to play in very powerful ways to understand fairly complex forms of psychopathology. But let's just start, quickly, and we'll dive into understanding Pavlovian conditioning. All right, so we want to look at this picture, and we're trying to focus our attention here, um, really on this piece right here, the unconditioned stimulus. That's the meat powder. And down here is the unconditioned response, the UR, if you will, is salivation. What's important to note about this connection is that it is unlearned. That's what it means by unconditioned. No one has to teach a dog that there's a connection between meat powder and that at that point in time they need to start salivating. It happens naturally. It happens automatically. So we really then start with this connection. Now, the next thing that we want to look at is the conditioned stimulus. So, if you will, in and of itself, there is no connection between a tone and salivation. So, if in the absence of learning, a tone is not going to elicit salivation from a dog, that's not going to happen. But there is a natural link between not a natural link, but if a tone is paired with meat powder, so the tone comes first and the meat powder immediately follows it, then what happens is that the brain will make a link between the tone and the salivation itself, because these two inevitably go together. So you get a little tone, bing, and you get the meat powder associated with it, and that will elicit the salivation. And eventually, all that's actually needed then is for the tone to pull up itself. The tone will elicit salivation, and that would be classical conditioning in and of itself. It's a very powerful concept. if we start to uh, create other learning models or other types of learning with this, you can start to see its power because it begins to explain how people develop anxiety, how people develop phobias. Okay. Um, so if you have a situation where you um, are in a classroom and whenever, let's just start over here, an unconditioned stimulus might be a shock, right? That's painful, right? So you got a little device attached to your wrist, okay, and when that device can shock you. So the shock itself creates, let's say, an unconditioned response here of anxiety, okay, because nobody likes being shocked. So you see that natural connection. A shock naturally elicits anxiety. Now, let's just suppose that um, you hear a tone here in the class, and the tone is then repeatedly paired with the shock. Okay, so before you know it, just the tone itself, okay, will create anxiety. Okay, in this case, then the anxiety would become a conditioned response, whether or not the shock is actually there. That is the natural learning process within Pavlovian conditioning. Okay, now you can learn this in more complex ways through vicarious learning. In other words, it very well may be that you observe this whole connection in other people. You see or hear about somebody driving in a car, which in itself would be a conditioned stimulus, and they're in a horrible car accident, and people die, which naturally elicits, in this case, it would be anxiety. Okay, so anxiety is a automatic response, and so your brain makes a connection between people driving in a car and people dying and anxiety. Okay, so now you have that kind of learning model. Okay, so now we're looking at pretty much the same thing. And what we want to try to do is understand how classical conditioning can make sense of how your dog learns how to stay in your electric fence. So your hidden electric fence that's underground. This is based on a classical conditioning model in part. So what we'll try to do is link these things together. Now, first of all, just keep in mind that for a slight electrical shock that's delivered to your dog's neck is going to naturally elicit anxiety. So that's an unconditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned response is anxiety. And so in order to teach your dog how to stay in the yard, what we want to do is sort of create this natural sort of link. So what you do is you set up white flags around your yard, around the perimeter of the yard. And these are usually, so if your fence is sort of set up around your yard like this, Alright, what you want to do is put those white flags a little bit inside that perimeter, so they set those up around the perimeter. And then your dog has this electric collar on his neck, and the way this collar is set up is that by the time the dog gets to the white flag, he should get a beep. Okay, so if you will, it's creating this visual connection, okay, between these two, the white flag and the beep. So you're really going to learn this at two levels, both a visual and an auditory level. And when they get to the white flag, they'll hear the beep, and within just a second or so, it's going to deliver a shock, okay, which then creates anxiety. Okay. Now, in an interesting piece then, as you repeatedly bring your dog up to this, okay, to each of these flags, walking them around the yard, and they run into one of these flags, okay, they're going to each time get a beep and then a shock. So now we've got this repeated learning trials. White flag, beep, shock, anxiety. Now all of it becomes encoded at the same time. And the brain then remembers it this way. Now, this is not sufficient to explain how dogs learn to stay in here. Okay? Now, what you have to do is combine this classical conditioning with Skinnerian operant conditioning. Okay? Especially, as we've already discussed, the escape behavior or avoidance behavior. So what's going to happen here is that when the dog feels the shock, okay, then what you're going to do is retreat with the dog toward the center of the yard. That's going to be the goal. So you want to retreat inward to the center of the yard. You run with them, right? And that keeps them so that they learn that the way that you escape the shock is to run this way, to run into the yard. And in a way, it creates this illusion for your dog that the anxiety or that the shock extends all the way out here indefinitely. Okay? We want them to know, or at least think, that the shock continues and that without ceasing it will continue. This is a crucial illusion that you're creating for your dog. That the only solution for them is to run back to the center. Okay, to stay in here. Otherwise, it's just going to be unbearable pain or discomfort.